When was the last time that you traded for something? Do you remember? Have you traded for something recently? Anybody? Do you remember trading for anything? You have to go back, maybe think of some jacks or, I don't know, marbles. I don't know. I'm not trying to say anybody's into that kind of stuff. I just don't know. Not like you traded, you can say, well, I traded some cash for something and somebody gave it to me, or I used credit. But have you ever swapped something kind of even, Steven? Now, for me, I think that I thought about this, and I thought, well, the last time I really traded something was some players in fantasy football. I traded, this player for that player. I remember trading baseball cards as a kid. My kids, they trade Pokemon cards. If you don't know what that is, that's okay. I remember for a while there was these things called Pogs, and people used to trade those too. If you have no clue what I'm talking about, don't even look it up. It's not worth your time. But it's just one of those things that people did. Now, trading isn't something that seems to happen too often unless we're talking about sports, right? I found a list of the worst trades in baseball, and I thought I'd share some of those today as we thought about the idea of trading. The number 5 worst trade is when the 1987 Detroit Tigers, they traded 20-year-old John Smoltz to the Braves for 36-year-old Doyle Alexander. Who? Now, apparently Doyle actually helped the Tigers that particular season, but he went on to retire 2 seasons later, while John Smoltz, if you're familiar with baseball, went on to pitch lights-out baseball for 20 more years, or 2 decades. Number 30 from the worst trades in baseball were when the Padres traded Anthony Rizzo to the Chicago Cubs for somebody named Andrew Kashner. If you're a Cubs fan, you like Anthony Rizzo, and even though they stole the trophy from my Indians, we can go ahead and let them away from that. The number 15th worst trade was when the Cubs traded Lou Brock to their arch rivals, the St. Louis Cardinals, for somebody named Ernie Broglio. Now, Broglio recorded an outstanding record of 7-19 over 3 years, while Lou Brock spent 16 seasons stealing 880 bases and winning 2 World Series in St. Louis. The number 1 worst trade in baseball was when Babe Ruth was traded from Boston to New York for $100,000 because the Red Sox owner needed cash to fund musicals and plays at his theater that he operated on the side. It's easy to look at those trades, isn't it, and think like, man, that was pretty bad. It's always easy after the fact to look back and say how good or bad a trade is, but in the moment, most of those probably seem somewhat even, or at least just the best deal they could get. And as much as we would like to call them the worst trades of all time, or at least this article that I got this from would call those the worst trades of all time, the team that benefited would call the best trades of all time, wouldn't they? They would say, hey, those weren't bad trades, those are great trades. Now, you might not be a baseball GM or an owner of a team. If you are, then talk to me after service. I'd like to, get in on that a little bit. But and you might not have traded much in recent memory. But today we begin a sermon theme for the rest of this month, which has a trade in the title. It's called Beauty for Ashes. Now that might seem like an odd saying, and it definitely seems like an odd trade, because the winner seems obvious when you have beauty and ashes. But most of you, I'm sure, are aware, but if you're not, I'm going to let you know that that comes from the Old Testament prophet Isaiah, and it's from a promise that God gives his people about someone that he is sending. And it gives a stark contrast between their current reality, which they would happily describe as ashes, and he would say that's the difference between now and a future reality that he will bring about. And so that's where we see this idea of beauty from ashes. And rather than just talk about it, let's read in Isaiah chapter 61. I'm running out of hands here, so might need some help flipping slides. All right. Isaiah chapter 61, in the first verse, you might recognize this because Jesus stood in the synagogue and read this as well. But here's what we say. Here's what God says through his prophet Isaiah. The Spirit of the sovereign Lord is upon me, for the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to comfort the brokenhearted and to proclaim the captives will be released and prisoners will be freed. He has sent me to tell those who mourn that the time of the Lord's favor has come, and with it the day of God's anger against their enemies. To all who mourn in Israel, he will give a crown of beauty for ashes, a joyous blessing instead of mourning, festive praise instead of despair. In their righteousness they will be like great oaks that the Lord has planted for his own glory. That certainly paints a pretty vibrant picture, doesn't it? Something exciting. It's this stark contrast from opposite ends of the spectrum is what we see here. And you have this picture of hope that God's anointed is proclaiming to people. For the people, these people had been taken from their homes and from their homeland. They were dispersed in exile. It's as if they had been kicked out of the house they had always known, the world they had always known, including the things that gave them comfort. All of that is long gone, and they're looking for hope. But it seems like all they have is ashes. Can you relate to Isaiah's audience? Is the world as you once knew it on its way out or long gone? Are the once familiar and dependable things which gave you comfort, things of the past, on their way out? What about things which once connected you to God, now are no longer in sight? If you know the people of Israel, they thought that they would be okay as long as the temple stood, as long as they could see the temple. It's like they would check it every once in a while. Okay, the temple's there, we're still good. Now they were taken to a completely different land. They couldn't see the temple, and so they weren't so sure that things were going to be good. But if any of those things kind of describe you, even just a little bit, you're in luck. Because God's message isn't just for his people of 800 BC, it's also for those who endeavor to follow him in 2022. That message is this: the Messiah is coming, offering his people a tremendous trade, beauty for ashes, a joyous blessing for mourning, a festive praise instead of despair. The message was for God's people then, and it's for God's people today. It's an answer of hopefulness for all who cry out in despair. He's saying, I hear you, help is on the way. That's what Beauty for Ashes is about. It's a phenomenal trade for those receiving beauty. But trading always involves risk, doesn't it? There's always a risk involved. What if the deal is too good to be true? Have you ever thought that when someone calls you and say, hey, we just want to let you know you want an all-expenses trip paid on a cruise down to the Caribbean? Have you ever thought, this is too good to be true? Or maybe they call you and say, we'd like to talk to you about your car's extended warranty. We have great prices for you, if only you already knew. And you think, yeah, it's too good to be true. A good trade involves risk, and sometimes we think, what if it costs me everything? What if I have to give them everything and I get nothing in return? We actually read about one such trade in the Old Testament book of 1 Kings 17. And what we find there is another prophet of God. This is Elijah. And the prophet Elijah had just told King Ahab that there's going to be a drought. No dew, no rain, no nothing, which is horrible English. But he said it, well, something close to that. And he said, there's not going to be any moisture for a few years until I say there's going to be. And so we're going to read that now in 1 Kings chapter 17, beginning in the 8th verse. First Kings chapter 17, beginning in verse 8. And here's what we read. Then the Lord said to Elijah, go and live in the village of Zarephath, near the city of Sidon. I have instructed a widow there to feed you. So he went to Zarephath. As he arrived at the gates of the village, he saw a widow gathering sticks, and he asked her, would you please bring me a little water in a cup? As she was going to get it, he called to her, "Bring me a bite of bread too." He lost his manners apparently between the first command and the second because he didn't even say please. But he says, "Bring me a bite of bread too." But she said, "I swear by the Lord your God that I don't have a single piece of bread in the house. And I have only a handful of flour left in the jar and a little cooking oil in the bottom of the jug. I was just gathering a few sticks to cook the last meal, and then my son and I will die." Can you imagine being Elijah? I mean, first of all, God tells you to go to the king and tell him that a drought is coming for the next few years. That's like going to somebody who has a lot of power and authority to not only take your life, but it's the most powerful person you know. And so it's like saying to them, "Hey, by the way, you're going to lose your income and your ability to work. Good luck." Then as Elijah goes into hiding, obviously God knew that was important. He sends him into hiding. God sends him to someone for him to live off of. And it's a widow with one meal. I mean, can you imagine being Elijah and traveling all that distance to get there and be like, "Okay, I'm finally going to get some food." And she says, "Guess what? I only have one meal, and it's for me and my son." Maybe you can't imagine it. That's fine. But if we can put ourselves in his shoes, it just has to be like, man, sometimes when you follow God, you get to something and you think, man, I'm following God. I'm doing the difficult task. I'm going to get there and it's going to be glorious. And you follow God and you get there and there's one meal. And you're like, what in the world is going on? Now imagine being the widow. Obviously, her husband passed away, and she's watched over days and months as her situation went from bad to worse. Her husband passed away to begin with, and her ability to provide for her own son has evaporated into thin air. She's run out of provisions. And just when you don't think life can get any more tough, what happens? A man of God shows up asking for the little that you have left. That's like salt in the wound, isn't it? Saying life is treating me bad. It's so horrible I have one meal left, and guess what? Here comes a guy asking for it. Can you blame her if she would have thought, why didn't he save up any food for himself? Why does he want all that I have left? Why won't he let us have one last enjoyment before I die? I would imagine that the widow probably thought, maybe not, maybe I'm projecting onto her, but I could imagine her that she wanted to say, "Go get your own. There's nothing here." Verse 13, here's what we read happens. But Elijah said to her, "Don't be afraid. Go ahead and do just what you've said, but make a little bread for me first. Then use what's left to prepare a meal for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, there will always be flour and olive oil left in your containers until the time when the Lord sends rain and the crops grow again." So Elijah offers the widow a trade, doesn't he? He says, if you can give me what you have left and then use the little bit of left for yourself, then the Lord will take care of you. That's the trade he's offering, isn't it? He's saying, give me what you have. It sounds a little fishy, doesn't it? Maybe it's because we've seen too many preachers on TV that say, if you just sow that seed in me, you'll get 100-fold in your bank account, as that hasn't happened. So then we start to get a little skeptical, doesn't it? When someone comes along and says, well, if you give me the last of what you have, then I'll take care of you. Too good to be true doesn't even seem to scratch the surface, I imagine. Now, it reminds me of one of my favorite cartoons. I don't know if you've seen this cartoon, but it reminds me of the story of Mickey and the Beanstalk. Now, if you've never seen Mickey and the Beanstalk, it's a lot like Jack and the Beanstalk, but it involves way better actors. Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck, and Goofy, I don't know, dog. What is he? Anybody know? And Goofy. They all live in a farmhouse. And there is nothing left to eat on their table except for one piece of bread and one bean. And so what if you've seen it, if you haven't, I'm going to describe it to you. But what they start to do is Mickey starts to cut the piece of bread, and you can actually see through the piece of bread. It's so thin. And then he cuts the bean so thin that you can see the bean, and they have two little flappy pieces of bread, and they put the bean between it. Donald cannot take it any longer, and he goes out to slaughter their skin and bones cow. He's going to take matters in his own hand. Now, instead, Mickey stops and says, Donald, wait, we can't do that. I will take this cow into town, and I will trade it for enough food to feed us. Now, he leaves, and before he gets back, we find Donald and Goofy almost loopy with anticipation about all the food they're going to eat. They say, we're going to eat and eat and eat and eat until we die. I'm quoting this show. It's great. Great dialogue, right? But then Mickey reveals that he traded the cow for what? Magic beans. Or green beans. Green beans they could have ate. Magic beans, they didn't know it. Magic beans? Are you serious? How naive could Mickey be? Their hopes and their dreams for full bellies are dashed. Why? Because now they just have these beans. Would you have blamed the widow if she looked at the prophet Elijah and said, no way, Jose. I'm not falling for that. I'm no Mickey Mouse. We wouldn't have blamed him. There's a huge risk here. She has to give up what she has for the promise of a prophet that she just met. Common sense would surely tell her that she had a duty to take care of her son first. Would you have blamed her if she said, I can't do that, I have to take care of my son? We would have blamed her for that. We would have been like, that makes sense. But God is asking for something beyond her own common sense here, isn't he? He's asking her to give up what she's holding in her possession for what he has for her. God is asking the widow at the lowest point in her life so far to risk what she has left for hope. Pick up back in verse 15. And here's what we read. So she did as Elijah said, and she and Elijah and her family continued to eat for many days. There was always enough flour and olive oil left in the containers, just as the Lord had promised through Elijah. Always enough flour and oil. Always enough to make it. Now, it didn't say that all of a sudden her barn filled up with just piles and piles of it, does it? No, it says she always had enough. She always had enough to make it. The widow took that huge risk, and she didn't end up dead like she probably expected. Instead, she ended up living much longer. Mickey's beans might have grown a big beanstalk, but the widow's trust in the face of risk grew into life for her and her son. She traded what she knew for what she could hold on to, what she could actually touch and control. She risked it all for what God knew and what God controlled. She traded her resources for God's resources, and she received the blessing of so much more than she had in the first place. Imagine looking back at that risk she had to take. I imagine that she would have just laughed at how little it seemed. You ever do that? You talk about days when you didn't have very much and how precious it was to you, and then you're enjoying days later and you're saying, man, I remember when that was just such a big thing to me, and now I'm so thankful that I have so much more. Why? Because when you don't have a lot, a little is more than a lot. It's your life. And so she traded all of that for what she didn't know because she trusted God. In that moment, it seemed huge, but now she was experiencing what was big. God asked her to give up what little she had left and promised a better future, and she took him at his word through Elijah. Her last bit of flour and oil had to be so depressing seeing it with her eyes. Imagine that just the day before she went to get those sticks. Before she met the prophet, you see that all you have left is for one more. Can you imagine even having up the energy to go and get the stuff to make it? It would be like, it's like walking your own death sentence, isn't it? You know that's the last you have. But God didn't let that to be the end of her story. Instead, he offered to make it just the end of a very bad chapter. But to get there, she had to let go. For many of us here today, there are parts of our life, or maybe the whole kit and caboodle of our life, where we can't see how that will ever get any better. We just can't see it. Whether we got here by a series of bad choices, or we just happened to be the circumstances of life that just happened to us, we can relate to that widow who has given up on anything else happening. So when God comes along and speaks to us to give up the little bit of good that we have left, it doesn't always make sense to us. Because we're saying, God, there's nothing else good in my life. All I have is this one thing. We want to say, God, are you paying attention? Have you ever thought that or prayed that? You probably are all too Christian for that. I have. It's like God's asking you to give up something when you don't have anything. God, I need more, not less. The only thing I need of is less trouble and desperation, because I'm at my wit's end. I can't make it any farther in this job. I can't make it any... There's a cricket on the floor. Sorry, I'm like pointing over here, and I can make it with a cricket, but I can't make it any further. Have you ever had those thoughts? I can't make it any further in that job. I can't make it any further in that relationship. I've done all I can, and God, it's just dead. It's not going to work out. God, if I give it to you, then what's left for me? But the words of Elijah answer those thoughts, and he says, do not be afraid. It's easy to say don't be afraid, but is it easy to live it? No! This is not I'm trying to trick you. No! It's easy to say don't be afraid. When my kids are walking through the church and it's pitch black, I can say to them, don't be afraid, and they're saying, that's easy for you to say. Right? It's easy to hear don't be afraid, but it's hard a lot of times to live it. What risk is God asking you to take today? What thing or things is he asking each of us to give to him? Now, maybe you're not in despair yet, but the risk of letting go of what God asks from us might be keeping us from a future reality. Have we ever thought that? Maybe the thing that we cling to are really more like ashes, and we're missing out on the beauty that God has for us. Sometimes we think, God, I can't do it any other way. It has to be this way or it's not going to work out. And God's saying, let go of it. I have something different for you. And it might not look the same as it did, but it will be good because it's from me. Maybe that part of your life that you consider to be dead or nearly dead is that way because you've never risked giving him control of it. There are relationships that seem broken beyond repair, lying in the ash heap of our past because we can't risk forgiving that person because we think they could hurt us again. And I'm not talking about physical abuse. I'm not talking about abuse at all. But I'm talking about somebody maybe that wounded us. And we've just left it in the ash heap saying, you know what? I'm done with them. There are stories that we've cut off and we've left for dead because it seemed too risky to let God in and move in his way. There are testimonies of our own flour and oil that will never run out, that are waiting to be written and told, all hinging on our willingness to take that risk and giving it to God. I spent 2 years at what was called Circleville Bible College in Circleville, Ohio. It's now Ohio Christian University. And when I was there, I had a friend. I got to know a guy because I was going through like a cohort, and I got to know this guy. And he, from the time I met him through that whole thing, he felt a clear call in his life from God to be a chaplain in the military. He knew it. Every time he talked to him, what are you going to do when you get out of here? I'm going to be a chaplain in the military. I know that's what God's called me to. For the better part of 2 years, he said that again and again. God has called me to be a chaplain. Then one day he came to class and he wasn't his normal self. And I asked him like, hey man, what's going on? And he said, well, I had a talk with my fiance. And she said, no way, shape, or form would she marry him if he was a military chaplain. She said, I can't live that life. So he told her, okay. He said, I'll figure something else out. And I recognized that part of him was dying. The risk of losing his fiancée was too much for him to give up, to answer the call from God. And so he let that call die. He left it in the ash heap of the past. Now, I don't know if he made the right choice or if he didn't. It would be easy to say, oh, you messed up there. I don't know what they went through, but what it seemed to me was like he didn't say, well, I'm going to keep praying until God shows it to my fiance. I'm going to keep doing that because I got to answer this call from God. Or he didn't say, man, I'm going to have to make a decision between the call from God and her. Instead, it looked like he wasn't willing to risk it for God, trusting that God would work it out in his fiance or find him a different fiance. Is God calling you to risk something to answer his call on your life today? That's the question that you and I have to deal with. Is it something as simple as building in more margin into your schedule to have time for holy interruptions? Some of us have booked our calendars so full of activity that when God presents a holy interruption, we say, sorry, we're too busy. And we can't even engage with God. Or actually what starts to happen is people start to look like interruptions and speed bumps. I have places to be. I've got things to do. Get out of my way. And there are times when we are missing a holy interruption with a God because we have no margin in our schedule. Others of us, and again, probably other people not here, have spent our money, even pre-spent our money with credit. So when God calls us to generosity, we say, sorry, I'm all tapped out. So when we decided years ago to buy whatever we bought on credit, months, even years before that risk came to us, when the risk comes to face with us, even if we wanted to, because we already promised it to someone else, we have to say, I'm sorry, I can't do that. I've met people, believe it or not here, and I'm being honest there, that's not just a joke. I met people, not at this church, but they said, I want to go on a mission trip. And they said, I feel all my life that God was calling me on a mission trip. And I said, why aren't you going? They said, I can't afford it. And I said, can you afford not to go? I mean, what is so important? What have you bought? What payments have you agreed to that would be worth more than what God has for you on that mission trip? And so what happens is we so think, well, okay, it's just this payment for the next 20 years of my life, and I can handle that, and it's this payment, and this payment, and this payment. And again, most of you are probably too smart for that. But sometimes you get so maxed out that when God comes to you and says, I want you to give to this person, or I want you to go and do this, we say, I can't. Because I decided before you even asked God that I needed a new car. And there's nothing wrong with cars, so don't hear that you need to go sell your car on the cheap. If you do, you come and talk to me, and I might buy it. But the point is, are we walking with enough margin? Are we living in a way that God can speak to us and we can answer faithfully? Or are we walking like a no-trade zone, where we live in the ashes of saying, oh, well, that's just life, when God wants to give us beauty? Or maybe the risk that God is calling us to isn't individual, but corporately as a church. There are pockets of every church, and our church is no different, that don't look like they used to. Where we once saw activity in life, we now get discouraged because we see dust and rooms left dormant. We know the history. We know the good. We know the bad. And now we just mourn what used to be. We think things like, it's all because of this that our church isn't what it used to be. It's all because of that person. It's all because of that decision, whatever the case may be. And what God is asking us today, I believe, is will you grieve that? Will you enter into grief for that? And then will you forgive it? And will you give it to him? Not just brush it off and say, oh, that was nothing, that was then, and we're moving on. But to actually enter into grief for it and say, man, that stunk. That hurt. God, I've never been able to get over it. Not just say, oh, sure, I forgive them because you're expected to because you're a Christian. Meanwhile, when someone brings it up, you get angry, you get frustrated, and there's an emotional pull on you every time. I want to invite you that maybe it'll take a phone call, maybe it'll take a letter, maybe it'll be that you have to offer someone forgiveness, even though it seems like they should be asking for forgiveness, but you'll have to ask them, Will you forgive me for never forgiving you? Does that sound risky? Yeah. Could it be possible that whatever God is asking us to risk today in a trade with him will actually be lopsided in our favor on the other side? That once we look back on it down the road, we're saying, I am so glad I did that. Man, it was hard. Man, it was painful. It was like death to me, like giving my last breath or my last meal. But the joy that God has brought me into was worth it. Or do we need to hang on to control? Do we need to hold tight to the little bit we have, because if we give that up, then somehow we're agreeing with it, or whatever else? Do we need to see, well, if I do that, what's going to happen on the other side? Do I need to see 3, 4, maybe 5 steps down the road beyond the decision and make sure that it's the right one? Or will we hear the words of God that says, don't be afraid? And we can have hope that God is writing something completely new and beautiful for us. Are we walking around with just a little flour and oil, and God has never-ending food waiting for us? I want to encourage you today to make that trade. Today. Don't go home and think about it. Don't go home and be like, well, gosh, oh gee, what should I do? I'd like to invite you and encourage you to give it to him today. And saying, God, I don't want to hold on that. I don't want to talk about it. Every time I talk about it, I relive it. God, I want to release it to you, because only you can do with it what needs to be done. Give him the despair. Give him what seems like your only bit of chance of life left. Give him anything that it takes, because he can turn graves into gardens. He can turn mountains into valleys. He can turn obstacles into highways, and he can give you beauty for ashes. Jesus is the ultimate example of this. He's the first. And if we're following him, he calls us to do the same, to follow him in the hope of being made new. Trade him your life, and he will give you a new one. God has beauty. God has a joyous blessing and a festive praise, ready and willing to trade for your ashes, your mourning, and your despair. Praise be to God that he hasn't left us where we are, that he hasn't said that's your story for the rest of your life, but instead he said, let me write a new chapter for you. That's the God we serve, and that's the God that calls us to give him our ashes for his beauty. Will you stand with me?